Hello. My name is Julio Guato. I am a member of the editorial board of Science and Society, the Journal of Marxist Studies in the English language with the longest publication record in history. We can be Googled or found at scienceandsociety.com. The editor of the journal is David Leibman. Associate editor is Kirsten Munro. Other members of the editorial board are here. Kirsten is also, along with Russell Dale, co-host of this event. This is our first ever video conferencing event, and I have to thank my employer, St. Francis College, because they are providing us with the online platform to conduct this event. And traditionally, we have our annual editorial meeting early in December, and we have it split into 3 parts. The first part is our business meeting, what we call the business meeting. It's a discussion of the state and the prospects of the journal. The second part of the meeting is typically the most exciting one. We have an invited lecturer that who presents to the editorial board on a topic of interest to Marxists. And as you know, to Marxists, nothing human is alien. There are questions, answers, comments, etc. And finally, there is a third part, also very exciting, a dinner in a local restaurant. Of course, COVID has altered our business as usual. So we had the idea of taking the second part of our annual meeting, the lecture and discussion, into this video conferencing platform. So we plan to have similar events in the near future. So please stand by. We will be announcing them in due time. And this leads me to today's event. So our invited speaker today is Professor Göran Therborn. Göran is a sociology professor at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. He's one of the most influential sociologists with a scholarly work that is explicitly influenced by Karl Marx's work. And I will refer you to his Wikipedia page for further details on his work and his trajectory. But please let me say a few words about how I personally came to discover his work, and then much more recently, his social media presence. Back in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s, I had just received a college degree in Cuba. I returned to my country of origin, Mexico, and I got to read 2 very famous essays by Perry Anderson reviewing the landscape of Western Marxism, what he called Western Marxism. As you probably know, Anderson viewed the split between the workers and socialist movement on the one hand, and the development of Marxist ideas on the other hand as characteristics, as kind of the characteristic curse of Western Marxism. But he somehow insinuated that there was the hope of a future merge or synthesis of these social processes on a higher plane than in prior history. One of the bases for hope, according to Anderson, was that many of the strands of Western Marxism were coming to Marxist ideas and to socialist issues from the academic world, where they were critically incorporating an analytical arsenal that had the potential to inform and enrich not only Marxist doctrines, but eventually the socialist struggle. So you had a new crop of brilliant intellectuals who were powerfully influenced by Marx, that were approaching Marxist ideas fully equipped with the analytical apparatus of several particular disciplines in the social science, in the conventional social sciences. One of these people was a brilliant sociologist from Sweden who was exploring, among other problems, the essential structures and processes through which a ruling class rules society. And that person was none other than Göran, our guest today. So that's how I first became interested in his work. In Mexico, Siglo XXI had published a Spanish version of his essay on how como domina la clase dominante. So I started to read his book. I was very enthusiastic about it. I was very interested in seeing how people with high Western academic credentials under Marxist influence were tackling the thorniest problems that Marxists and socialists faced. So I only made it to the 2nd or 3rd chapter. The material was difficult because it made use of a terminology and conceptual apparatus that was alien to my prior formation. But the sheer effort of engaging Göran's work, I think, helped me later on to form my own conception, my own views on the nature of political and legal rule under capitalism. Göran's essay on how the rulers rule this is the approximate title, was just one of a long list of solid works that he has since produced, enriching the stock of Marxist literature. So as we speak, his career and intellectual life remains as vibrant as ever. One day, this 2020 of COVID memory, I learned that Göran was on Facebook. I immediately requested his Facebook friendship, and voila, we are honored to have him today with us. So again, you can Google him and find his bibliography and read him. Göran is here today with us to discuss the way in which COVID-19 may reshape our society or social life. So he will present for about 50 minutes or so, and then we will open the microphone for questions and comments. People can also use the chat facility at any time to formulate questions and or comments. And Russell is video recording the event. In due turn, we're gonna post the video on YouTube or some similar platform. So here is Göran Therborn.
Thank you. Good morning, I guess I should say. It's a pleasure to be with you. Science and Society is a classical institution of the left, which I first encountered in my student days in the early 1960s. So it's quite an interesting experience. I'm sorry about this mishaps with the Zoom. We had rehearsed, but and then it functioned finally, but we have to try again. So thank you for your patience. I apologize for my part of the mishap. I'm going to read my presentation, something I never do under natural conditions, but I think I should do it here. I hope it won't be too boring for you. I mean, I know. I mean, reading a paper is always somewhat less attention catching than speaking directly. I'm going to give you a kind of a panoramic overview of how the pandemic is affecting the world. And I will deal with 6 or 7 different themes. I will first talk about the pandemic as a planetary experience and its ironic effects of deglobalization and geopolitical shifts, including the similarity of the liberal March 2020 to the socialist August 1914. I will also deal with the seemingly approaching US-China war. Thirdly, or fourthly, depending on how we can count the comparison between 2020 and 1914, the pandemic gives a kind of flashlight on states and governments and governmentality. Pictures of style, pictures of effectiveness, pictures of failure, and we'll look into that. And the pandemic also, or the pandemic experience, creates a particular class structure, like I would call the pandemic class structure of the world, which is slightly different from the competing usual theories of class, because it's based on the different experiences of the pandemic. And the pandemic also throws a sharp light on the social landscape more broadly seen, and we'll look into what that means. And finally, there is the basic question of the world after the pandemic. And I will argue that there are two types of scenarios we should expect, or at least and prepare for. As you know, I mean, always the unforeseen happens. But nevertheless, the two scenarios are 1945 and 1932. So this is what you will have to sit out. I hope you're sitting comfortably, all of you. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic operates as a magnifying force to social actors and as a magnifying glass to social observers. As a magnifying force, it has so far mainly strengthened pre-existing societal tendencies, but it has also, as a huge unexpected contingency, suddenly enlarged obstacles to many political projects of the left in Argentina, Mexico, Spain, for instance, but also on the right, even more dramatically perhaps, the projects of Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, Modi and Trump. While at the same time the pandemic is enlarging the room for economic maneuver available to the central banks and the governments of rich countries. It has magnified the tensions and frictions between states, regions and cities. And as a magnifying glass, it makes complex social patterns and their contradictions not only more visible, but also making class structures, political systems, and geopolitics appear more nakedly raw. The first theme is the most striking feature, I think, of the pandemic. Its planetarity, its contemporaneous and intercommunicated experience on all continents, from at least beginning of March 2020 and continuing for months at least. Never before in history has humankind had such a long, consciously common experience of life and death. The world wars and the Great Depression mainly engaged Eurasia and North America. And the commonality of the wars was the particular one of enemies fighting each other. The death toll of the so-called Spanish flu in 1918-20 was much higher than that of the current pandemic. It amounted to 40-50 million people, corresponding to something between 150 and 200 million of the population of today's world. In the US, the current equivalent to the 1918-20 viral deaths would have been 1.6 million dead. But the effects of the pandemic then were overwhelmed by the decisive stages of the very bloody war and by the colonial concentration of its victims, above all in British India and Kenya, brought there by returning soldiers from the imperial armies. And certainly by the post-war economic crisis, to which the deadly flu was apparently a minor contribution. The global paths of the current virus contagion still remain obscure, although it's clear that COVID-19 has first of all traveled the main thoroughfares of the world, from China to Western Europe and North America, preferably staying at global hubs like Paris, London and New York, and secondarily at national nodes from Jakarta and Delhi to Stockholm, Madrid, Cape Town and Sao Paulo. It has also ecumenically enjoyed international religious gatherings as launching pads of contagion. Christian in Daegu in Korea, in Ruse in France, Muslim in Delhi and Jakarta, and large mass gatherings from Mardi Gras in New Orleans to March 8th in Madrid. The international couriers of the virus have primarily been business people doing China business and holidaying upper and upper middle class people, carrying the contagion from their vacations in Europe, into Latin America, first to their maids. A closer look at this planetary commonality brings out the deep divisions of humankind. Divisions which foreshadow the ones likely to show up again at critical moments of the climate crisis. Old interstate bonds of alliance suddenly broke, albeit not necessarily irreparably, in the panic of border closures and the frantic competition for protective equipment. Even among the bonds among the Nordic countries, with past freedom and the common labour market since 1952 and 1955 respectively, and NATO and the European Union. All of them, in all of them, the bonds and the alliances broke. Each Nordic country unilaterally closed its borders to the others, virtually without advance notice. In the European Union, Germany suspended the EU's sacred freedoms, not only of movement of persons, but also of goods, and for some days stopping paid medical equipment from being shipped out, for instance, to Sweden. The French had more than one experience of NATO ally United States snapping up protective gear purchased in China on the airport tarmac by overpaying in cash what the French authorities had bought. So one could say that March 2020 in modern interstate history, or as some people would call it, in the post-war liberal international order, was like August 1914 in the history of the labor movement. That is, a moment when internationalist declarations and organizations were suddenly worth nothing, and Deutschland über alles, America first, and their synonyms were sung by almost everyone. Nationalism and big power geopolitics still trump global commonalities and international treaties. Neoliberal globalization took a hit in the 2008 financial crisis. But with COVID-19, not only have global supply chains been disrupted, their very existence is becoming suspect in the eyes of many power holders of the rich world as a risky dependence. And to Trump and the Trumpists, it's even as a kind of extortion of the rich by the poor. Incoming foreign direct investment, long seen by North Atlantic economists and politicians, as always beneficial and as a major vehicle of development, is now regarded as a threat by the rulers of the European Union as well as of the US, especially if the investors are Chinese. As the OECD editorialized in its 2020 economic outlook, the pandemic has accelerated the shift from great integration to great fragmentation. How far the latter will go is anybody's guess, but neoliberal globalization since about 1980 is dying. Another fatality of the pandemic is US so-called leadership and world hegemony. A death foretold when the US backed out of the Paris Agreement on climate change and effectuated by its leave of the WHO in the midst of the global pandemic. In only 3 of 53 countries were more people thinking the US had handled the pandemic better than China. That was in May, namely the United States and Taiwan and South Korea. Majorities in all 15 European countries surveyed find the US having a negative impact on global democracy, with a minus 40% negative score in Germany. Loss of hegemony is not the same as loss of power, though, economic and/or military. But it does both signal and imply an important change of the parameters of geopolitics. One of its implications has already become visible. an increasing resort to economic warfare, with the deliberate intention to starve nations deemed undesirable into submission: Cuba, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and including the mafia-like economic threats to the investigators and judges of the International Criminal Court. The unfolding of right-wing politics in the US during the pandemic has brought the world close to a US-China war. Not so much in the form of a deliberate full-scale US attack to eliminate the threat to US supremacy, but rather as a spiraled effect of a series of attempts to put China in its proper place as a secondary power and to deny its claims to be the legitimate heir of the ancient empire of the Middle Kingdom. Anti-Chinaism seems to have conquered the whole political establishment of the US, with Biden and Trump racing to be the most anti-Chinese. The houseboys at NATO are rushing to be of help, as was to be expected. And two of the most vicious war hawks of the US Congress, Marco Rubio and Robert Menendez, have launched an anti-China international parliamentary lobby on the basis of the Trumpist electoral pandemic campaign against China. Quote, "The resentment against communist China is due to its carelessness in handling the deadly COVID-19 virus and hiding the information with the world." But it's a lobby with much larger ambitions. Military confrontations in the South China Sea or around Taiwan and Hong Kong, egged on by the same kind of crusader lobbies which started the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, could easily be ignited. But the Chinese are not likely to run away. The background to this threat runs much deeper than Donald Trump's re-election campaign. The rise of China is a challenge to the US rule of the world and to the cultural supremacy of the so-called West. With Huawei at the head of 5G communication technology, for the first time in half a millennium, a technological vanguard is appearing outside Europe and its overseas transplants. To many power holders and aspirants of power in Europe as well as in the US, this is a glimpse of the yellow peril which the last emperor of Germany warned the West against. To what extent the US will bring on board all its satellites to ban Huawei technology is still undecided. But the only certainty in this contest is that the days of the Washington consensus are terminated. The populations of the sundown powers in Europe as well as North America may have to choose between adjustment to a new Asian-centered world order or a third world war. The uneven pandemic challenge to states and governments threw a flashlight on governments and states on their style of power, their effectiveness or ineffectiveness. Threw a light on the blustering, capricious and incompetent governments of Brazil, UK, USA and others, on the lethally brutal deployment of police and military in India, Kenya, the Philippines and South Africa, or the advanced digital surveillance in China and South Korea. And at the other end, the low-key governmentality of Sweden implementing the advice of its public health authority with non-police closures and social distancing. At the same time, the virus outbreak revealed the hollowness of the Swedish welfare state, of the decades of municipalization, privatization, and neoliberalization, and the social democratic as well as bourgeois governments. They had fragmented public health care, handed over much old age care to corporate capital accumulation, promoted by right-wing regional and local governments, particularly and fatally in highly virus-exposed Stockholm. Since the amount of viral diffusion is still little known, it's difficult to evaluate properly the responses. But that said, it's clear, at least as the first wave of the pandemic is concerned, one world region stands out as a success and another as a big failure. The best available criterion is the death rate, which unfortunately is not calculated according to a quite uniform standard. However, the differences between the two regions seem so tremendous enough to withstand a final demographic counting of 2020 excess deaths. The winner in effectiveness is East Asia, where the pandemic started. The region follows the arc of ancient Chinese civilization, but not any contemporary political arrangements. The states of failure are the powers of Western Europe and North America. On July 1st, at 11:41 GMT, East Asian COVID-19 deaths per million population amounted to 8 people in Japan, 6 in South Korea, 3 in China, 0.9 in Hong Kong, 0.3 in Taiwan, and 0.0 in Vietnam. Among Western powers, the death toll so far was 644 in the UK, 606 in Spain, 575 in Italy, 457 in France, 393 in USA, 228 in Canada, and 108 in Germany. The Western average is 430, and the East Asian is 3. The West-East mortality ratio of 143:1. Trying to unravel the causes of this contrast between East Asia and the West is, to some extent, premature, probably ranging from more recent epidemic experiences in East Asia to social cohesion and collective social organization, state capacity, and digital advance. But the contrasting outcomes held an incipient shift of state and cultural capacity from the West to the East. By the way, the pandemic death rate ratio is similar to the casualty ratios of the late 19th century European colonial wars, inverted. The late June forecast for the economic consequences of the corona crisis point in the same direction. The World Bank predicts for 2020 a global GDP decline of 5%, a US decline of 6%, of 9% for the Euro area, and a 1% growth for China, bouncing back to almost 7% in 2021, with the world, the US, and the Eurozone crawling back more slowly by 4 to 4.5%. The June 24 IMF update is basically similar, as are the Asian Development Bank forecast for East Asia as a whole and for China, adding that the Japanese GDP is expected to grow by 4% in 2020. The OECD is overall more pessimistic, albeit with a similar relative pattern. It thinks the Euro area economy will shrink by 14.5% in 2020, growing back a bit by 3.5% in 2021. The US declining this year by 8.5%, growing barely 22% in 2021. The picture coming out of these still uncertain forecasts is that no OECD country will have recovered to the level of 2019 by the end of 2021. But the whole average of East Asia will have, despite losses in Japan and South Korea. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa would be at about the same, not very prosperous level as in 2019, while Latin America would be still poorer. The Eurozone seems to be the pandemic's biggest economic loser. Internationally, the recent pandemic tendencies of modest international economic convergence will continue. The June 2020 World Bank estimates predict high-income countries to contract by 6.8% and recover by 3.8% in 2021, while corresponding figures for developing countries are minus 2.4% this year and a growth of 4.7% next year. For low-income countries, the forecasts are even slightly better. Now, these figures refer to what is nowadays distinguished as the real as contrasted with the financial economy. The medium-term financial effects are very polarized. Only during the first 2 months of the pandemic, there was a registered outflow from so-called emerging markets of $100 billion. At the same time, the central banks and the treasuries of the solid rich economies have learned that with the mysterious disappearance of inflation, with strong currencies and the confidence of international finance, they have almost unlimited capacity to spend money. The fiscal deficit of the US government is expected to approximate a fourth of GDP. In Japan, it's expected to be around 15%, and in the Eurozone and the UK, 12 to 13%. This is a luxury denied to third world countries, haunted by overdue debt, aggressive private creditors, falling commodity prices, and weakened currencies. Furthermore, in the third world, we find the people living in extreme poverty on $1.90 a day. And they are expected to grow by 60 million this year. And it's in the third world where we also find what experts call a looming hunger pandemic, adding to the people with acute hunger, who have already increased from 80 to 135 million in the last 4 years. So now we come to the pandemic class structure of the world. The pandemic is a great unequalizer, and the COVID-19 pandemic highlights the class structuration of inequalities. The UNDP calls it a systemic crisis in human development and foresees a sharp fall of its Global Development Index, the first since 1990, driven above all by a massive drop in effective education, in turn largely due to very unequal internet access. Unequalization is by class, gender, and race or ethnicity. The magnifying glass of the pandemic has made us see a global class structure beneath the usual competing theories of class or stratification. When I then discern 6 pandemic classes, in the sense of 6 classes of typical pandemic experiences. On top are, of course, the owners and top managers of big capital, without worries, neither for their health nor for their economic affluence, protected from the virus, planning their next enrichment, and escaping from lockdowns to second, third, or nth homes, if need be, by helicopter, as in Santiago de Chile last April. Within this class, the pandemic has accelerated ongoing tendencies of capital differentiation. Huge gains, while most people are suffering, have been made in e-commerce, digital technology, communications and logistics, and in pharmaceuticals, of course. Stock market gambling has also continued to be lucrative until the bubble burst. After an initial plunge, global stock markets have bounced back with a deepening of the viral impact. US trading in spring 2020 has been said to be 4 times higher than 2019, according to local brokers, illustrating again the decoupling of capitalist finance from the human economy. At the other end, big banks and big oil have had their market values sink, and airlines and big industrial corporations are making losses, though realistically being rescued by government handouts at no suffering to their CEOs and major personal shareholders. Digital capital, headed by Amazon and Microsoft, is the winning fraction of the untouched haute bourgeois class. Then we have the upper middle class, and also some parts of the middle classes, managers and professionals, who are having mostly a good crisis, keeping their salaries and working safely from home. In some countries, they comprise large numbers. In the US, 39% of the jobs are regarding as teleworking. Managers and professionals in US have fared better in the corona crisis than during the financial one in 2008, based on the labor market. Although they haven't been spared in seclusion this time though. Below the sheltered top echelons of big capital, small and medium productive business people engaged in providing goods or services have a very different pandemic. Above all, it has been an experience of worries, from often drastically declining revenue, including personal, uncertain futures, and fears of bankruptcy. To what extent the governments will help them out is kept uncertain. Mostly, there are the service workers in healthcare, elderly care, and in a number of sectors of officially essential work, caring for, feeding, protecting, and otherwise serving the more privileged classes with their parents, and to nationally varying extent also the non-privileged. Their income is insured, but their work puts them in the front line of viral attacks, sometimes fatal. Then there are two classes of unemployed. In the second quarter of 2020, global employment shrank by a good 10%, measured by working hours, rather evenly distributed across the world. The unemployed are also having a very different pandemic, and we should distinguish two classes of them. A bit above the bottom are the ex-workers with once stable jobs in the formal economy. The less worst off part are the workers on furlough, not dismissed from their job and receiving some government paid or subsidized remuneration for part-time or no-time work. This is mainly a European, but sometimes an East Asian practice, comprising a fourth of the EU workforce, about 50 million workers. Theirs are experiences of lockdowns, income cuts, and an uncertain future of work in many jobs, but also of a still continuing livelihood and housing with a job to look forward to with some chance. In the US and in most of the rest of the world, the situation of the ex-holders of a job in the formal sector is more precarious than those in the on furlough. They are severed from their employment, but they can get some unemployment compensation, and for some there may even be unemployment insurance in operation. Then at the bottom, the sixth class, we have the cut-off workers of the informal economy, the day laborers, workers by the hour in rich countries, locked out street vendors. Government response to the pandemic has been to deny these people their livelihood by lockdowns, and thereby offer their housing as well. Usually there is some minimal and late safety net, which many are falling through. Sometime after proclaim a total lockdown 4 hours in advance, the Indian federal government, for instance, offered 5 kilos of grain and a kilo of pulses per month to affected families. The ILO has estimated that in the first months of the crisis, the earnings of informal workers fell by 60% globally and by 80% in Africa and Latin America. Many of these workers are migrants, either international intra-nation, rural to urban migrants, or international. And both of them desperately having been trying to get back to their home villages or home country across armed checkpoints and closed borders. In brief, the pandemic has bifurcated each of the conventional classes. The bourgeoisie between the untouched and the worried, the middle class between the served and the serving, and the working class between the furloughed and the destitute. The inegalitarian economic effects of Corona are clearly more marked than those of the Lehman Brothers crash, even though numbers on income and wealth distribution are not available yet. US data show also that women have been hit more hard than men, and ethnic minorities too relatively harder than in 2008. The effects on poverty and on human development have been incomparably higher than in 2008. The global decline of extreme poverty, a trend with only a couple of small oscillations since 1981, will be reversed in 2020, with a World Bank estimate of an increase by 10%, 675 million. The UN Economic Commission for Latin America foresees an increase of poverty in Latin America from 30 to 35% this year, and of extreme poverty from 11 to 13.5%. The pandemic has also highlighted the persistent poverty and food insecurity in rich countries through poor children's dependence on school meals in the UK and the US, which reluctant governments have been forced to keep open, even though the schools have been closed. If we look at the social landscape of the world, well, I think we find that it hasn't been reshaped yet, but it appears edgier, uglier, more fragile, and less unchangeable than before. Neoliberal economics obviously doesn't work anymore, nor, it seems, does a moderate so-called liberal order. On the other hand, forces of broad, radical social reform appear to have stalled. The class structure is being sliced rather than polarized. There is no leading geopolitical light in sight to any ideological vision, left or right, although there are East Asian lessons to study. The world is getting even more unequal, but where are the signs of the exploited and the excluded becoming stronger? Anti-union big digital capital aligned with finance, headed by Amazon, is the economic winner of the crisis. Nevertheless, I think there is a widespread sense of both the unsatisfactoriness and the vulnerability of the existing social system. Outside a few well-padded boardrooms, there is no celebration around, nor plan for the post-pandemic. The existing social systems increasingly apparent unfairness and ecological frailty under the clouds of climate change and further pandemics should be the starting point of progressive radical rethinking. In the piercing light of the pandemic, the malfunctioning of two features of most existing societies stand out in particular. One is the duality and division of labor markets in the third world between formal and informal employment, in the rich world between stable and temporary employment. Two similar systems in terms of insecurity, social rights, and wage level. Informal and temporary workers have been hit especially hard, losing their livelihood and now being thrust into poverty on a massive scale. There will be confrontations in the future between the forces and ideologues of so-called labor flexibility and all those heeding the ILO call for decent jobs and who think of jobs as means of human self-realization and social construction. The other dysfunctional social sector is private health care and old age care, Healthcare for private property has fragmented services and divided accessibility. It is intrinsically dysfunctional in meeting a large national health crisis. The delegation of care of the frailest elderly to private warehouses and to insolvent, incompetent and/or insouciant municipal authorities has turned out to be a kiss of death, leading to hecatombs of elderly, most spectacularly perhaps in Bergamo, Italy, in Madrid, and in Stockholm. The viral crisis has sustained pre-existing chauvinistic, xenophobic, anti-scientific, know-nothing movements. But so far, it seems, the virus has rather eroded than reinforced them. Trumpism, Modi's, Bolsonarism, etc. By showing their incompetence and brutality, which has become more blatant under the magnifying glass of the pandemic. Liberalism is another major loser of the pandemic. With the big liberal democracies of Western Europe and North America revealing themselves as among the least competent in handling the crisis. The June so-called call to defend democracy issued by an international Stockholm-based Idea Institute arguing that COVID-19 is also a political crisis that threatens the future of liberal democracy has to be seen as against this background as part of a pro-American campaign to muddy the waters, mainly, if not exclusively, directed against China. It starts by saying it's not a coincidence that the current pandemic began in a country where the free flow of information is stifled, unquote. The liberal reaction wants to formulate this issue as one of liberalism versus authoritarianism, which the latter, while much in existence, is hardly constituting a crisis-propelled threat, rather on the contrary. The real threat to this liberal order, or so-called liberal democracy, is a social polity, or social democracy in an ecumenical sense, without capital letters. What do the major successful managers of the pandemic have in common? China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore. They're all states and societies of social cohesion and collective social responsibility, at least and in particular in terms of national crisis. They have different political systems, including a version of liberal democracy in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and there are different degrees of economic inequality, China and Singapore being the highest. But they have all kept a cultural imprint different from the West, springing from ancient Sinic or Chinese civilization. These economically as well as pandemically successful social polities constitute a major challenge to Western liberals. They do not constitute any actual social democracy in a historical sense, nor any progressive beacons, but they do indicate that another world is possible, including a world potentially better able to deal with the accelerating climate crisis. The crisis has clearly strengthened at least three democratic and progressive social movements and intellectual currents. All of them pre-existed COVID-19, but all directly or indirectly reinforced by it. Most striking are the intercontinental mobilizations and political repercussions of the anti-racist movement. How much the sudden global anti-racist movement owes to the collective experience of the pandemic is unclear, but the coincidence is undeniable. Out of the Black Lives Matter has become the global most powerful anti-racist movement since the international anti-apartheid campaign. The second movement against femicide and violence against women has been stoked directly by the pandemic confinement effects of aggravating male violence against women, spearheaded from Mexico and South Africa with their bitter experiences. It's also a global movement of rejection of violence and exclusion. The third is an intellectual current rather than a social movement. It is the egalitarian enlightenment growing out of the 2008 awakening and coming to conquer at least a significant part of that ancient ideological bastion of capitalist inequality, mainstream liberal economics. It is a current recognizing that increasing inequality is a mounting and even paramount social problem of contemporary society. This is a current to which a whole cluster of Nobel laureates of economics belong, from Amartya Sen to Joseph Stiglitz, Angus Deaton, and most recently Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, another economist of recent renown like Thomas Piketty. Their views are echoed by the organizers of the World Economic Forum, the editorial board of the Financial Times, and even the current director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. The climate movement surged before the viral outbreak and has been in latency since then, but is likely to return as a fourth major actor after the pandemic. In the meantime, the skies above Asian cities free of fossil fuel pollution have become visible, and a world without complicated polluting supply chains has become desirable. Summing up so far in this theme, confronting the post-corona, even more inhospitable, inegalitarian, and unfair social landscape is a political context where the smug liberal status quo is questioned and nervous. And there are at least four significant global movements and currents of thought challenging it. Adding to this comes the rational anger of all those who were socially screwed by the common human pandemic: classes, ethnic minorities, women, youth. To bring these forces together for a push of egalitarian, ecological and peaceful change would require a political leadership and organization which today is beyond the horizon. It is certainly neither utopian nor unprecedented. Now the end is almost in sight, but it will deal with how the pandemic will end. How it will end is, of course, still unknown. Will it be defeated? Will it have to be accommodated? What shape will the economic crisis and recovery take? A V, a U, or an L? In other words, rapid returns to normalcy, increasingly unlikely, slow recovery, or a prolonged recession. In any case, because of its unique planetary thing, the corona pandemic is likely to become a historical landmark, meaning that there will be an after as well as a before. Modern North Atlantic history has two previous compressed such after moments. 1932, after the outbreak of the continuing 1929-1931 depression, and 1945 after the end of World War II. 1919-20 is another candidate of a landmark period, but its most dramatic outcomes: parliamentary democracy with universal suffrage, national independence, and socialist revolutions, and none of them likely to be central to post-COVID-19. In the early stages of the pandemic, 1945 looked like a possible end, at least in some parts of the Americas and Europe. Neoliberal marketization and privatization obviously couldn't cope. And on April 3rd, the editorial board of the Financial Times declared, quote, "Radical reforms are required to forge a society that will work for all. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investments rather than liabilities, and look for ways to make labor markets less insecure. Redistribution will be again on the agenda. Policies still recently considered eccentric, such as wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. Unquote. The outlook then is reminiscent of the overwhelming rejection of miserly pre-Keynesian conservatism and liberalism in 1945, when von Hayek's idea then that the social democratic welfare state would be, quote, a road to serfdom, unquote. And that ridicule has now befallen the contemporary claims of neoliberals. So a better, more egalitarian world seems possible, with public health and old age care for all, an education system which gave all pupils an equal chance, the progressive taxation that kept inequality in check and could finance public services and security for everybody. A world committed to combat racist, sexist, post-colonial inequality and to confront the threats of the climate warming. The spirit of 1945 is still there in the Financial Times, calling for a new social contract, or among the organizers of the World Economic Forum, hoping for and talking about a great reset. However, a 1945 scenario implied that the evil forces of inequality and violence had all been decisively defeated, literally burned to ashes in Berlin and Tokyo. This is unlikely to be the case when the pandemic ends. With the sharpening of geopolitical conflicts as well as of international conflicts, I've come to think that the end of the pandemic crisis is more likely to land us in a 1932 situation, which means a much broader range of outcomes, including disastrous ones. Then there were three major options. One was progressive social reform, chosen in the United States and in the Scandinavian countries. Another was violent authoritarianism, of which Nazism and fascism was one variant, a minority in terms of countries, most important in terms of power. More common was a more conservative subcurrent, triumphant in Japan, in Eastern and Southern Europe, and with Latin American offshoots. A third variant was what a Freudian would call an anal conservatism, for instance, in Britain and France before the interlude or the Popular Front. 2020's New Deal or social democracy would be a rational, evidence-based option, egalitarian, ecological, non-violent, listening to the climate scientists, and for the first time in the history of this discipline, backed up by a phalanx of distinguished economists. Above all, it would have to be a humane politics, recognizing, listening to, and committed to the non-privileged people of mankind. Where are the political forces strong enough to carry this out? There is support all over the world, and there will be struggle for post-pandemic radical reforms and radical change. But there will also be fierce resistance against transforming existing power structures and privileges. The authoritarian, inegalitarian, and violent, if not properly fascist, forces today have certainly not been crushed. And we had better not forget that those forces took the world to World War II. Known as part of the story behind World War I and World War II was that rising powers were challenging existing world rulers. Germany challenging Britain, Japan challenging the US. Today, the rise of China is seen as an unacceptable threat by the main spectrum of political influences in the US, and increasingly so also in the EU, Britain, and Japan. With the sharpening of conflicts during the pandemic, a US-China war has become a visible risk. And one can already envisage the EU foreign minister replaying Chamberlain in Munich. To close, the pandemic has been and is an experience of suffering and loss for millions of people around the planet. For us privileged survivors, this has been a life-engraving learning experience. It has shown us the historical impact of contingency, the planetary commons and its radical divisions, a sharpening of social and political alternatives, and an acceleration of the current dynamic of the world towards inegalitarian deglobalization and possible to a geopolitical US-China war. At the end of the pandemic, there will be an option of equality, climate adaptation, and peace, but only as an option, dependent on contingent forces and leadership still to be constituted. As in 1932, there will be other options already discernible, likely leading to prolonged misery for the non-privileged or to disaster by war or by climate catastrophe, or both. Thank you.
But I'm going to start with Barbara. Yeah, go ahead. If you can introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. This was very clear and very illuminating and sort of scary, but that's okay. We knew a fair amount of it, I guess. My name is Barbara Foley, and I'm Vice President at Science and Society. I'll be quick with my question. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you'd see would be the basis of a possible world war between China and the United States. I didn't hear you use the word imperialism, and maybe that was on purpose, maybe not. You talked about deglobalization, and it's clear that, obviously some of these supply chains are being reconfigured. But the last time we had a speaker at Science and Society, it was William Robinson, and he was making a strong case for the transnational capitalist class and for the complete entanglement of financial interests and economic interests of all the powers around the globe, including China. So I'm just, China and the United States, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, while there certainly is a ramped up nationalism going on in the world, to what extent is that in any way a reflection of actually really existing contrasting and conflicting economic interests among the different powers, and to what extent is nationalism being used ideologically to organize populations to support their respective ruling classes, but not necessarily be a reflection of different kinds of imperial interest? And one can contrast this to a degree with the situation in 1914 when the major European powers did, in fact, have their spheres of influence, their colonies, et cetera. Now, clearly, there are still spheres of influence, but if you even take Latin America, used to be the United States' backyard, and now you'll have China being the biggest, trading partner of Brazil, just as an example. So that's essentially my question, and you can either deal with it right now or hear a few more.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the basis of a possible US-China war, I'm not saying, it's bound to come, but it's increasingly likely. It's as I said, there is an eerie similarity between the situations of the two world wars, where they in the first or prior to the first, the rise of Germany challenging the British Empire, and the Second World War, with which had many ingredients, but one of them, of course, was the rise of Japan and the determination of the Roosevelt of the U.S. government to hold Japan down. So that's the and there is clearly, I mean, a fear a deep fear in American and some British and European circles as well, of a world in which the US will no longer, I mean, the dominant power in the world. A world when Hillary Clinton's children or grandchildren would have to grow up in a world centered on China. I mean, that's a horrible thing in her eyes and in the eyes of many American politicians. So I mean, that's and that's both political and of course it's economic. So I mean, it's an economic war going on, and between US and China, and will probably escalate long before, I mean, it comes to direct military clashes between troops. There will be lots of American attempts to stop China's rise into a major economic power. The campaign against Huawei is one example, and there will be many more, and so on. It seems that it's not just Trump and the Trumpists and so on. I mean, the Democrats are sort of full of war hawks as well. So there is a competition between the American political parties about who is the most anti-Chinese and the most anti-Russian. And there is still talking about imperialism. So, I mean, it's a kind of proprietary, I mean, it's even cruder than imperialism, a cruder conception of the world, a kind of US proprietary conception of the world and so on. Chuck Schumer is accusing Trump of being the president who lost Hong Kong, implying, I mean, that Hong Kong was to some extent an American possession, which Trump is now losing. I mean, that kind of mindset. And I don't think, I mean, like in 1914 and in 1939, I don't think we should put much hope into a transnational capitalist class sort of stopping the world from going to war. There will be trumped by politicians everywhere, and in the U.S. American, the U.S. Chinese conflict. I mean, there's a lot of economic conflict, lot of money involved, and so it's really it is a scary prospect, and I've been increasingly worried. I mean, seeing how the rhetoric and the economic warfare is constantly escalating, and it's spreading to Europe, which of course also has old imperial reflexes to effectuate again.
Okay, another person. raising hand.
Actually, I asked a similar question to William Robinson at our board meeting a couple of years ago. So I want you to consider further your 1945 scenario coming out of the crisis, and that is the possible implementation of a global Green New Deal, course driven by an upsurge, which we don't see yet, of transnational class struggle. I would note that the New York Times recently had an article which pointed to the resiliency of wind power growth in contrast to fossil fuel, even now, which may be a basis, at least a partial basis of this development. So my question is this: how can the divisions between fossil and green capital and China's ascendance as a power in the world be utilized to make this scenario a reality, or at least more likely? And thank you. I just want to identify myself. I'm a co-editor of what I hope will finally come out as an eco-socialist special issue of Science and Society. So thank you for a brilliant presentation.
Well, I think there is an increasing division within big capital between what you call fossil capital and the rest. And clearly, I mean, the high-tech managers and executives and owners and so on, I mean, are many of them are already, I mean, quite engaged in ecological environmental issues. So it's clearly a possibility of an important cleavage between the two, although it hasn't happened yet. But it can very well happen. And there are ideas around, I mean, about a global New Deal, including, I mean, in the what I call the enlightened bourgeoisie. I don't know how much of it there is in the US, but there is something in Europe, not so much in Sweden or Scandinavia, but in the around the London Financial Times and also in the German in Germany, and that could be some bridge, I mean, to progressive social reform in other fields as well. If you read the ideas around Financial Times' new social contract or the World Economic Forum's so-called Great Reset, you'll find that there is both of them have clearly both an ecological awareness, which is quite incompatible with the power of fossil capital, and a wish for what I call inclusive growth, and for at least some measures against inequality. But the problem is that so far, I mean, this egalitarian enlightenment has not really got any political force to represent them. So, I mean, neither in Europe nor in the US. So, and it's difficult to see, I mean, how it would be constituted, but there is this possibility, and if there ever will be, I mean, a kind of a realization of a 1945 scenario, that will, of course, include as a central part what you call a Green New Deal on a global scale.
David Leibman.
All right, Julio, I'll take it. I just like to bring us back to the COVID-19 aspect of things a little bit. What we're talking about different scenarios regarding possible rivalries among groups of capital or among international groups that represent social forces that in some level may reflect capital and may challenge capital. China, for example. What I'm thinking about a lot these days, and I haven't got a firm line through on it, is what the coronavirus condition in the world implies for socialism and for the possibility of socialist movements and advocacy. There are people who say that the coronavirus is a basic call for a new look at communism. You know, that we're on a forward trajectory here because of the obvious failure of neoliberalism and free market approaches to this crisis. And the data you gave at the beginning about the difference between the Chinese and the Western experiences with the virus are very interesting in that regard. But the classic conception of communism as a stage of development in historical materialist thinking generally is that it rests upon a platform of abundance, of development of productive forces. And what we see here is, on the contrary, a kind of an enforced return to scarcity and privation, and a sort of a communism, if you would call it that, which would reflect more the situation of primitive communism rather than an advanced communism based upon preconditions for genuine human freedom. So what should we say from the standpoint of the left about that and about where we're going today and what the possibilities are for a genuine resurgence of socialist and communist consciousness? We see indications of that around the world. But what about the effect of the coronavirus on the conditions for possibility of that kind of resurgence really being important?
Well, not in any direct, explicit sense and in an immediate short-term perspective. But I think we have to, well, first of all, about communism. I think we have to be aware of the planetary limitations which the environmentalists and the climate change movement have brought up. I mean, which was, for obvious reasons, I mean, not clear to Marx. So, I mean, for those of us who are working on theoretical concepts and future societies. I think how we should envisage a communist society under which is environmentally and in climate terms sustainable, I mean, is something which needs to be articulated. Perhaps, I mean, some people are already working on this. I missed that, but that's what I think is that's one of the aspects your question, I mean, brings up. But going back to the consequences of the pandemic, I mean, for socialism and communism. As I said, I mean, I can't see in the very immediate or short-term run, even in, I mean, the 1945 scenario, I mean, well, we all know, I mean, the socialist revolution in Western Europe and North America, I mean, was not on the agenda at that time. And I think in that sense, that still holds, I mean, for a 1945 in the 2020s. What is possible in the medium-term run is a turn to radical social reform, social and economic, cultural and ecological reform. But in the longer run, the reason why I think we have to, it all will center on what is going to happen in China. There is clearly, and the pandemic has made that possible, well, visible, and I argued that in my presentation, that there is a kind of a different polity and a different conception of society than the one predominant in Western Europe and North America, kind of the liberal sector. I call it a bit cautiously a social polity, meaning, I mean, a tradition of collective organization and collective awareness and social accountability, and which was crucial, I mean, to the effectiveness of East Asian countries in handling the pandemic. And there is, of course, I mean, at least thinkable, I'm not quite sure whether it will, how realistic it is, but it is quite possible, or at least thinkable, that the increasing US economic warfare against China and Chinese capital and the deliberate efforts of the American government, and that will continue, I mean, even under a Biden government, the deliberate efforts of the United States to stymie Chinese capitalism might very well stimulate some new thinking in China, that perhaps, I mean, a capitalist multinational corporations foreign investment road to great power is perhaps blocked, and that there might be other routes for China, in which case, I mean, the socialist option, I mean, would come forward. I mean, that's I have no idea if the odds of it emerging, but it's certainly imaginable. So in that sense, I mean, the attempt to trample on Chinese capitalism might have some pro-socialist effects in China.
I was thinking that it would have been great to have William Robinson take part in this event, because it's thought-provoking. You know, I think that this juncture now is posing the it's testing the hypothesis. You know, that there is a transnational capital with a coherent and robust institutional expression that you know, in this kind of situation, you would expect those institutions and those forces moving forcefully to prevent the sharpening of these geopolitical collisions. Anyways, so just a thought. Any other?
May I just put in a question? Do you or anybody else see any signs that big U.S. capital is intervening to hold back the attacks on the campaigns against China?
Well, I'm going to say something about it. Kind of the challenge from an analysis viewpoint is that there is a very sharp political or electoral season in the United States right now. So the temptation, right, to use demagoguery, right, to gain in the electoral ground, it's there. But that, you know, the issue is how superficial is that, or how that, you know, add contingency and all that, how that kind of reinforces the structural push towards this international coalition with China. And as you mentioned, Göran, right, also the Europeans have that temptation. They have that impulse. You know, you call it like the imperial reflexes or something like that. So there's different layers of, you know, different structures with different depths. It's very difficult to sort them out, you know, and to see how they may play out in the future. In any case, I think that the lesson for the left is, of course, organize to prevent, to counterpose to this, you know, zero-sum game narratives that now, you know, Trump and even on the Biden side, the Biden campaign side, are promoting, right? It's like, you know, China wins, that means that we lose, etc. That we have to counterpose a kind of the socialist, internationalist conception of, you know, unity of the working class across international differences and all that. And 2 cents.
I think there is also, I mean, a need for a peace movement. I mean, because I mean, this is really getting serious. So, and if, I mean, all the war hawks, I mean, are allowed, I mean, to operate unopposed, or opposed only by talking about other issues, about socialism or inequality or the climate and so on. I mean, the roads which opened, I mean, to Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, will next time, I mean, lead to the Taiwan Straits.
Okay, anybody else wants to answer Göran? Göran asked the audience, kind of like bounce back the question to you guys. Anybody wants to intervene? We still have a few minutes just to complete the 2-hour frame. You have to unmute.
Can I just, it's not another question, but I really think it's been enormously valuable. And what I like particularly about it is the range of people who have participated, including folks who are not part of science and society on a regular basis, have expressed an interest and signed in on this. And please continue to write to us about what you'd like this to become. I'd like to particularly thank Julio for all the work he did on this, and Kirsten and Russell as well for their contribution to it. But and of course, Julio will say something about our speaker in a moment. But to Göran, Therborn for agreeing to make a presentation, and I think we are at the beginning of what we can do with this forum. We can open it up and develop it in lots of different ways. But that's going to take everybody putting their ideas in and sending us your thoughts. So please do that in the future. And it was really fun to see everybody here today.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions or interventions, I would like to ask everybody to unmute your microphones. So you have to over and find on the lower left-hand side and applaud our lecturer today. Göran, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Julio.
Yeah, stick around. We'll be announcing the other events soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.